Her dad slid a $25,000 check across the table and told me to disappear before I ruin their bloodline. When I asked if he really thought I was just after her money, he laughed and said, You're a parasite in a polyester suit." I just stared at him. That was 3 months ago. Yesterday, he collapsed in his driveway holding a foreclosure notice. I pulled up to Camilla's parents' mansion in my 2009 Honda Civic that looked like it had survived a demolition derby. Paint peeling, dent in the bumper, clear coat flaking off like dandruff. Through their window, I watched her parents watching me, her father's face shifting through the 5 stages of grief just looking at my car. Lawrence opened the door wearing a suit that cost more than my car if it was new. His handshake felt like a job interview where I'd already failed. Shannon emerged, dripping in jewelry, examining me like bacteria under a microscope. At dinner, Lawrence poured wine for everyone except me, sliding the bottle away like I might steal it. He pointed to the kitchen and suggested I grab a beer on the bottom shelf. Shannon asked about my job with the enthusiasm of someone inquiring about a terminal illness. When I said financial advisor, Lawrence actually snorted wine. He assumed I meant those MLM schemes, comparing me to his nephew who sold supplements on Facebook while living in his mother's basement. They served a separate meal for me, chicken, because ribeye was probably not to my taste. The interrogation escalated. They asked if I'd gone to state school. Shannon's face suggested I'd said, learned finance from YouTube. Me having a roommate at 28 was apparently a deal breaker for them. Lawrence launched into how he owned 2 companies by my age, actually lifting his foot to show me shoes worth more than my car. They kept mentioning Camilla's ex, Zach, Harvard MBA, Goldman Sachs, just bought a penthouse. Shannon's stage whispered loud enough for the neighbors to hear that he still asked about Camilla. They mocked my polyester blazer, my parents, my career, saying I am helping teachers budget their sad little pensions. Lawrence pulled out his phone, showing me luxury car listings like a disappointed father with college brochures. The word parasite got thrown around. Shannon worried aloud about their future grandchildren riding in my death trap. Then came the checkbook. $25,000 slid across the table like a bribe in a bad mob movie. Lawrence's terms for me: disappear tonight, delete his daughter's number, or he'd call his golf buddies on Vanguard's board about inappropriate behavior with clients. My phone erupted with notifications at the perfect moment. The screen lit up, showing a business transfer I had to deal with. Lawrence's face went white as printer paper. The tech mogul's voice boomed through speakerphone as he confirmed the $50 million transfer, mentioned I was the youngest advisor to ever manage $1 billion in assets, and gushed about my TED Talk that inspired his daughter's Harvard thesis. Shannon's wine glass shattered on their marble floor. Camilla smiled like a cat with a canary. She explained how I'd retired at 25 after my startup sold, how I only manage money now for fun, taking clients I respect. The cars, the clothes, I donate 70% of my income. But here's where it got interesting. I mentioned their financial advisor who just retired, the one who embezzled from them. Their faces went from white to gray. Then I dropped the bomb. If they didn't file for bankruptcy in the next month for my company to take over and save them, their entire business would go bankrupt anyway. Only without me to help them come out on top, they'd lose everything. Lawrence collapsed into his chair like a deflated balloon. Shannon's tears started flowing, probably real Hermes this time. I handed Camilla a folder detailing their financial ruins, why Zach really kept calling, the whole pyramid of lies they'd built. I admitted I came over that day to help him, but if they wanted to ignore my advice, they wouldn't be welcome staying in my home. As I walked to my hit-up Civic, my phone buzzed. Camilla caught up to me on the driveway, grabbing my arm. "Dylan, stop. I need to tell you something about Zach." Her voice was shaking. "Remember how my parents suddenly started having financial problems 8 months ago, right after I broke up with him?" She glanced back at the house where her parents were still visible through the window, Lawrence on his phone. His father's investment firm holds the notes on 2 of their mortgages. Zach told me last week that if I didn't come back to him, his dad would call them in. My stomach dropped as I processed what she was saying. He's been buying up their creditors, one by one. That embezzlement scandal with their advisor? Zach's fraternity brother was the forensic accountant who discovered it. I stood there in the driveway, my mind racing through the implications. 8 months of systematic financial destruction, all orchestrated by a Harvard MBA with daddy issues and a bruised ego. Camilla pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages. Her hands trembled as she showed me screenshot after screenshot. Zach's texts started sweet, then desperate, then threatening. The progression was textbook manipulation, but what caught my attention were the details he mentioned. Specific payment dates, exact loan amounts, insider information no ex-boyfriend should have. Through the dining room window, I watched Lawrence gesturing wildly on his phone, while Shannon poured herself another glass of wine with shaking hands. They had no idea their financial collapse wasn't bad luck or poor management. It was revenge, served cold and calculated by someone they'd welcomed into their home for 2 years. Camilla's voice cracked as she explained more. Zach had been visiting them weekly since their breakup, playing the concerned ex who just wanted to help. He'd recommended the new financial advisor who later disappeared with their money. He'd introduced them to investment opportunities that tanked. He'd even suggested the refinancing deal they were considering tonight with his fraternity brother's company. My phone buzzed again. 3 of my clients were texting about strange calls they'd received, someone claiming to be investigating financial irregularities in my practice. The timing wasn't coincidental. If Zach could orchestrate his ex-girlfriend's parents' downfall, he wouldn't hesitate to come after me. I glanced at my Civic, then back at the mansion. The smart play was to leave, protect my own interests, let Lawrence and Shannon learn their lesson the hard way. But Camilla's eyes held a desperation I recognized, the look of someone watching their family destroy itself from the inside. Lawrence appeared at the front door, his face flushed. He waved his phone like a weapon, shouting something about an urgent meeting with their new financial advisor. Shannon stumbled behind him, mentioning papers that needed signing tonight. The advisor was already on his way over. Camilla grabbed my arm tighter. The refinancing documents her mother mentioned at dinner. They were sitting in Lawrence's study, waiting for signatures. If her parents signed those papers tonight, they'd triple their mortgage payments within 6 months. Legal, but predatory. Classic Zach. I made a decision that went against every instinct I'd developed in business. Instead of protecting myself, I walked back toward the house. Camilla followed, confused but hopeful. Inside, Lawrence barely acknowledged our return. He was pulling documents from his briefcase, spreading them across the dining table. Shannon cleared away the wine glasses, making room for what what looked like 100 pages of legal text. Neither of them questioned why their financial advisor was coming at 9 in the evening. Desperation makes people stupid. The doorbell rang 20 minutes later. Lawrence practically ran to answer it, ushering in a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a business school catalog. Expensive suit, perfect hair, practiced smile, but his handshake was weak, and his eyes darted around the room like he was memorizing exits. Todd Morrison, he introduced himself, from Morrison Financial Solutions. I'd never heard of them, which was strange considering I knew every legitimate financial firm in the state. His business card looked fresh from the printer. Literally, I could smell the ink. Lawrence didn't notice. He was too busy spreading out the refinancing documents, pointing to tabs marked with signatures. Shannon offered Todd wine, which he declined, claiming he never drank during business. Professional, rehearsed, fake. I sat back, watching Todd work. He had the patter down, throwing around terms like equity optimization and leveraged asset restructuring. Impressive to someone drowning in financial jargon, meaningless to someone who actually understood finance. When Todd mentioned the interest rate, I nearly choked. 3% above market rate, hidden in complicated calculations across multiple documents. By the time Lawrence and Shannon figured it out, they'd be locked into payments that would drain their remaining assets within 2 years. Camilla caught my eye. She'd noticed her mother's phone buzzing with texts. Shannon glanced at them, smiled, then showed Lawrence. Zach says Todd's the best in the business, she announced. He vouches for him completely. The pieces clicked together. Todd probably owed Zach money, or favors, or both. This wasn't just about financial revenge, it was about control. Zach wanted Camilla's parents dependent on him, grateful to him, indebted to him, the son-in-law who saved them from ruin, even after their daughter broke his heart. I stood up, stretching casually. Todd, interesting structure on these loans. Mind if I ask about your interpretation of Regulation Z compliance? His smile flickered. Of course, standard federal truth in lending requirements. Everything's fully disclosed. Right, but specifically regarding the adjusted percentage rate calculations in Section 1026.17, I noticed your disclosed APR doesn't seem to include the mandatory insurance premiums. Todd's face went pale. He shuffled through papers, buying time. Well, those are calculated separately. Actually, they're not. I kept my voice conversational, like we were discussing weather. Federal law requires all mandatory charges be included in the APR calculation. I wonder what's really going through Dylan's mind right now, showing up in that beat-up car to meet rich parents who clearly hate him before he even walks in. There's something odd about how he just sits there taking all their insults about his job and clothes without defending himself at all. These documents show 9%, but with the required insurance, it's actually 11.9%. That's securities fraud. Lawrence looked up from the papers, his business instincts finally kicking in. Todd, explain this. Todd stammered through an explanation that made no sense. The more he talked, the deeper he dug. Shannon's phone kept buzzing, Zach checking on his plan's progress. Camilla slipped out of the room while her parents focused on Todd. I heard her footsteps heading toward Lawrence's study. Smart girl. Whatever else was in that briefcase Todd brought, we needed to see it. The room's atmosphere shifted. Lawrence's desperation was morphing into suspicion. He started asking pointed questions about Todd's credentials, his firm's history, his relationship with Zach. Each answer was worse than the last. Shannon's wine glass trembled as she set it down. But Zach said he promised this would help us. Help you? I pulled out my phone, showing them screenshots I'd taken while they were distracted. These terms would help you straight into bankruptcy. Accelerated bankruptcy, actually. Instead of having a year to restructure, you'd have maybe 3 months. Todd stood abruptly, reaching for his documents. I think we should reschedule. Clearly you need time to review. Sit down. Lawrence's voice had the edge I recognized from our earlier confrontation. The executive who'd built 2 companies was finally waking up. You're not leaving until you explain why my daughter's ex-boyfriend is orchestrating my financial ruin. The doorbell rang again. Through the window, I saw Mrs. Chen from next door looking concerned. Shannon answered, probably grateful for the interruption. Mrs. Chen's words changed everything. I'm sorry to bother you, but there was a young man here earlier asking about your house. He wanted to know about property values, recent repairs, even asked about your pool maintenance costs. I thought it was strange. She described Zach perfectly. He'd been casing the neighborhood, gathering intelligence for his financial assault. The pool repairs she mentioned, they'd been done off books to avoid permits. Only family would know about them. Lawrence's face went from pale to furious. He turned on Todd with the intensity of a man realizing he'd been played. You have 30 seconds to tell me everything, or I'm calling the police. Todd cracked like cheap paint. The words poured out, how Zach had approached him 6 months ago, how he'd offered to clear Todd's gambling debts in exchange for this one favor, how the whole thing was legal but unethical. He was supposed to get the signatures tonight before we could review the documents properly. Camilla returned, holding her phone. She'd photographed everything in Todd's briefcase. Emails from Zach, contracts with other families, a whole network of financial manipulation. The scope was staggering. We weren't the first, or the last. Shannon sank into a chair, processing the betrayal. She'd defended Zach, trusted him, believed he still cared about Camilla. The weekly visits, the concerned calls, the helpful recommendations, all of it was calculated destruction. My phone rang. My assistant warning me about suspicious activity on several client accounts. Someone was probing for vulnerabilities, testing security. Zach wasn't just coming after Camilla's family. He was coming after anyone who stood in his way. I looked around the room, at Lawrence's shattered pride, Shannon's tears, Camilla's quiet strength, Todd's pathetic collapse. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about a dangerous narcissist who couldn't handle rejection. The smart play was still to walk away. But sometimes the smart play isn't the right play. Sometimes you stand and fight, even when the battlefield isn't one you chose. Todd, I said quietly, you're going to call Zach right now. Tell him you need him here to close the deal. Tell him whatever you need to, but get him here. Todd shook his head violently. He'll call me. You don't understand what he's capable of. I understand perfectly. I pulled out my phone, showing him the recording I'd been making since he walked in. What I don't understand is why you think prison is better than facing Zach. The room went silent. Everyone stared at the phone in my hand, processing the implications. Every word, every admission, every detail of the fraud captured. Lawrence found his voice first. You recorded this? Old habit from my startup days. Document everything. I looked at Todd. Make the call. As Todd dialed with shaking fingers, I caught Camilla's eye. She understood what I was doing. This wasn't about saving her parents' money anymore. This was about stopping stopping a predator before he destroyed more lives. The beginning was over. The real fight was about to begin. Todd's hands shook as he held the phone to his ear. I watched his face contort through various expressions: fear, desperation, then forced calm as Zach answered. Todd's voice cracked slightly as he explained that Lawrence was ready to sign, but needed clarification on a few details. The lie came out stilted, unconvincing. Todd glanced at me nervously as he mentioned the midnight deadline, emphasizing how the special rate would expire if they didn't act fast. Through the phone's speaker, we could hear Zach's voice, smooth and confident. He instructed Todd to push harder, to remind Lawrence about his deteriorating financial situation. The casual cruelty in his tone made Shannon flinch. Todd ended the call with promises that Zach would arrive within 30 minutes to personally oversee the signing. The room erupted into motion. Lawrence began rifling through the documents again, this time with the focused intensity of someone who'd built companies from nothing. His fingers traced columns of numbers, his lips moving silently as he calculated. Shannon paced near the window, occasionally peering out at the driveway. Camilla moved closer to me, her hand finding mine. Todd sat frozen in his chair, the weight of his confession settling over him like a shroud. He kept glancing at the door, then at his phone, clearly calculating whether he could make a run for it. I positioned myself casually between him and the exit, making it clear that leaving wasn't an option. My phone buzzed with another text from my assistant. 3 more clients had received calls about my supposed financial irregularities. The pattern was escalating. Zach wasn't just targeting Camilla's family, he was systematically attacking anyone who might protect them. Lawrence suddenly slammed his hand on the table. He'd found something in the documents, a clause buried on page 47 that would grant power of attorney over certain financial decisions. Not complete control, but enough to manipulate their remaining assets. The realization transformed his face from confusion to rage. Shannon stopped pacing and approached Todd. Her jewelry caught the light as she leaned over him, studying his face with the intensity of someone seeing clearly for the first time. She asked about the other families he'd mentioned. Todd's resistance crumbled further as he named them: the Johnsons from the country club, the Patel family whose daughter had dated Zach briefly in college, the Washingtons who'd opposed a business deal with Zach's father. The pattern was sickeningly clear. Zach targeted anyone who'd crossed him, using financial manipulation as his weapon of choice. Always legal, always deniable, always devastating. Camilla's phone lit up with a text. Her friend Emma was outside, insisting she needed to speak with her urgently. I watched Camilla's face as she read the message, saw the moment of recognition. She showed me the screen. Emma had included a photo of a check for $10,000, Zach's signature clear at the bottom. Lawrence noticed our reaction and demanded to know what was happening. Camilla explained about Emma, about the bribe, about her friend's crushing student loans that made the offer almost irresistible. The room fell silent as we processed this new level of manipulation. I made the decision to let Emma in. She might have information we needed, and keeping her outside would only complicate things. Camilla went to the door while I kept watch over Todd, who was now sweating through his expensive shirt. Emma entered like a storm, still in workout clothes, her face flushed with emotion. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, immediately launching into her story. Zach had approached her at the gym, casual and friendly at first. He'd asked about Camilla, expressed concern about her well-being. Then came the offer, $10,000 just to have coffee with Camilla and share how much he'd changed. But Emma had recognized the manipulation. She'd seen it before, in college, with 2 other girls Zach had dated. The same pattern every time: charm, control, then calculated destruction when they tried to leave. She showed us screenshots of conversations with those women, their stories eerily similar to what was happening now. Lawrence absorbed this information with growing horror. His executive mind was connecting dots, seeing the full scope of what they'd almost fallen for. He turned to Todd with renewed intensity, demanding to know every detail of Zach's plan. Todd, perhaps sensing that cooperation was his only path to redemption, began revealing more. Zach had detailed files on dozens of families, not just those he targeted, but potential future victims. He operated through a network of desperate people like Todd, those with gambling debts, medical bills, or other financial pressures that made them vulnerable to his offers. The doorbell rang again. Through the window, I saw Mrs. Chen had returned, this time with her nephew. Shannon let them in, and I immediately understood why they'd come. The nephew, still in his banking uniform, held a folder of documents. He spread them on the table next to Todd's papers. The nephew showing up with banking documents right when they need evidence? That timing feels awfully convenient, doesn't it? The contrast was immediate and damning. The legitimate refinancing documents from his bank showed completely different terms, different rates, different structures. Todd's papers were sophisticated forgeries, just legitimate enough to pass casual inspection, but fraudulent at their core. Mrs. Chen explained that she'd called her nephew after her earlier visit, suspicious about the young man asking about property values. Her nephew had pulled records and found something disturbing. Multiple refinancing applications had been submitted for houses in their neighborhood, all through Todd's fictitious company. Lawrence's phone began ringing. His country club friends, his business associates, all calling with the same story. They'd received strange refinancing offers, investment opportunities that seemed too good to be true, financial advisors appearing out of nowhere with urgent proposals. The network was vast, coordinated, and all traced back to Zach. I felt the weight of the situation settling over the room. This wasn't just about one family's financial troubles or one man's obsession with his ex-girlfriend. This was a systematic assault on an entire community, orchestrated by someone with the resources and intelligence to make it look legitimate. Shannon's phone buzzed with a text from her hairdresser. Even she had been approached, asked seemingly innocent questions about the family's routines, their financial habits, their vulnerabilities. The invasion of privacy was complete, methodical, terrifying in its scope. Todd's phone rang. Zach's name appeared on the screen. Todd looked at me, terror plain on his face. I nodded, gesturing for him to answer. We needed to know Zach's current state of mind, his plans for tonight. Todd answered with a shaky greeting. Zach's voice filled the room through the speaker, cold and businesslike. He was 10 minutes away, he said, and expected the papers to be signed when he arrived. He reminded Todd about their agreement, about what would happen if Todd failed. The threat was implicit, but clear. After Todd hung up, the room burst into activity. Lawrence called his attorney, not Richard, who'd been compromised, but his backup counsel. Shannon began calling friends, warning them about the refinancing schemes. Camilla and Emma huddled together, pooling their information about Zach's past victims. I focused on Todd, pressing him for more details about Zach's operation. The picture that emerged emerged was of a man who'd turned revenge into an art form. He didn't just want to hurt those who'd wronged him. He wanted to own them, control them, reduce them to begging for his help. Mrs. Chen's nephew made a crucial observation. The forged documents, while sophisticated, had tells that a trained eye could spot. He pointed them out. Slight inconsistencies in formatting, registration numbers that didn't match actual banking databases, legal language that sounded right but didn't quite match standard contracts. This gave me an idea. I asked Todd about the other families Zach had targeted. How many had actually signed? How many had been saved by last-minute interventions? Todd's answer was chilling. Most had signed, trusting in Zach's reputation and their own desperation, but a few had escaped. The Washingtons had grown suspicious when their actual banker called to confirm an appointment they hadn't made. The Johnsons had been saved by their daughter, a law student who'd spotted the fraudulent language. Each near miss had taught Zach to refine his approach, to close the loopholes. Lawrence's attorney called back. He'd run quick checks on Morrison Financial Solutions. As expected, it didn't exist, at least not as a legitimate financial institution. The address Todd had provided led to a virtual office, the kind anyone could rent by the hour. The registration numbers traced back to shell companies, layers of misdirection designed to frustrate investigation. The clock on the wall showed 11:15, 45 minutes until the supposed deadline, though we all knew that was artificial pressure, but Zach didn't know we knew. That gave us an advantage, however small. Camilla had been quiet, processing everything. Now she spoke up, sharing something she'd kept hidden. Zach had been sending her daily emails for months, mixing declarations of love with subtle threats. She'd saved them all, thinking they were just the ravings of a heartbroken ex. Now she saw them differently. They were a roadmap of his psychological state, his escalating obsession, his detailed knowledge of her family's finances. She showed us one email in particular, sent 3 weeks ago. It mentioned specific details about her parents' mortgage payments, their investment portfolio, even their monthly expenses, information he could only have gotten through illegal means or inside sources. Emma added her own revelation. She'd been documenting everything on the advice of her therapist, who'd recognized the patterns of abuse in Zach's behavior. She had recordings of conversations, screenshots of texts, a paper trail that painted a picture of systematic harassment and manipulation. The doorbell rang. Through the window, we could see Zach's Tesla in the driveway. He stood at the door, impeccably dressed, holding a bottle of expensive wine like a peace offering. The same Harvard tie he'd worn on his first date with Camilla. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Lawrence looked at me, then at his family. The executive who'd built 2 companies was gone, replaced by a father protecting his family. He nodded toward the door, a silent question in his eyes. I made a quick decision. We'd let Zach in, let him think his plan was working. But first, I positioned everyone strategically. Todd would stay at the table with the documents. Lawrence and Shannon would play the desperate parents. Camilla and Emma would stay in the background, recording everything. Mrs. Chen and her nephew would remain as witnesses, and I would be the wild card Zach hadn't planned for. Shannon opened the door. Zach entered with the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. He greeted Shannon with exaggerated warmth, handed her the wine, complimented her on her jewelry. Every word was calculated to remind them of better times, of what they'd lost, of what he could restore. He saw me and paused, just for a moment. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He hadn't expected me to still be here. In his plan, I should have fled after the confrontation at dinner, intimidated by Lawrence's connections and threats. Zach recovered quickly, dismissing me with a casual glance. He focused on Lawrence, approaching with an outstretched hand. Lawrence shook it, his face a mask of desperate hope that I knew was fake, but Zach bought completely. The performance began. Lawrence talked about their financial troubles, his voice heavy with defeat. Shannon added details about sleepless nights, worried about their future. They played their parts perfectly. 2 people struck down by circumstances and ready to accept any lifeline. Zach absorbed it all with barely concealed satisfaction. He moved to the table where Todd sat with the documents, running his fingers over the pages like a pianist about to perform. He began explaining the refinancing terms, his voice taking on a helpful, almost paternal tone. I watched him work, noting his techniques. He used their first names frequently, creating false intimacy. He referenced shared memories, times when he'd been part of their family. He painted a picture of their future, stable, secure, with him as their savior. But underneath the smooth delivery, I caught glimpses of the real Zach, the way his jaw tightened when Camilla moved into his peripheral vision, the flash of anger when Emma shifted, drawing his attention, the barely controlled rage simmering beneath his polished exterior. Todd played his part, nervously explaining technical details when prompted, but his hands shook as he pointed to signature lines, and Zach noticed. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face. He asked Todd if everything was all right, his tone carrying a subtle threat. That's when Lawrence's phone rang, his attorney, calling at the worst possible moment. Lawrence silenced it, but Zach had noticed. His eyes narrowed, scanning the room more carefully now. He saw Mrs. Chen and her nephew, processed their presence, calculated the threat they might represent. The atmosphere shifted. Zach's helpful demeanor began to crack. He pressed Lawrence to sign immediately, emphasizing the midnight deadline with increasing urgency. When Lawrence hesitated, asking to read through the documents once more, Zach's mask slipped further. He pulled out his phone, showing Lawrence something on the screen. From my position, I could see it was an email draft addressed to Lawrence's biggest clients. The subject line alone would destroy his reputation. Zach's thumb hovered over the send button, the threat explicit now, but Lawrence had found his spine. Maybe it was the presence of witnesses, or the knowledge that we had evidence of the fraud, or simply a father's protective instinct finally overriding his pride. He pushed the documents away, his voice steady as he declared he wouldn't sign anything tonight. Zach's transformation was instant and terrifying. The helpful advisor vanished, replaced by someone cold and dangerous. He stood slowly, his movements controlled but radiating menace. He looked directly at Camilla for the first time, his eyes holding a possessiveness that made everyone in the room tense. He began to speak, his voice low and measured. He talked about investment, about time spent building a relationship, about returns he was owed. The business terminology barely disguised the obsession underneath. He wasn't talking about money. He was talking about Camilla like she was a commodity he'd purchased. Emma stepped forward, unable to stay silent. She confronted him about the bribe, about his attempts to manipulate her. Mrs. Chen's nephew just happens to be a document expert who can spot forgeries. The timing of everyone suddenly calling Lawrence with similar stories feels awfully convenient for building their case against Zach right now. Zach dismissed her with a laugh. calling her a failure who couldn't even manage her student loans without help. The cruelty was casual, precise, designed to wound. That's when I noticed Todd reaching for something in his jacket. For a moment, I tensed, ready to intervene, but he pulled out a phone, a second one I hadn't known he had. He held it up, showing Zach the screen. It was recording, had been recording since Zach walked in. Zach's control finally shattered. He lunged for Todd, knocking over chairs in his rage. Lawrence moved to protect Todd, and suddenly the room exploded into chaos. Shannon screamed. Mrs. Chen's nephew called 911. Emma and Camilla backed away, still recording on their phones. I positioned myself between Zach and the others, not aggressively, but firmly. He turned his rage on me, his face contorted with fury. He ranted about interference, about people not knowing their place, about the natural order of things being disrupted. The police sirens were audible in the distance, growing louder. Zach heard them too. His rage transformed into something colder, calculation. He looked around the room, assessing his options, planning his next move. He reached into his jacket, and everyone froze. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a folder. He threw it on the table, pages scattering. They were photographs, documents, private information about everyone in the room. My client's financial records, Emma's therapy notes, Mrs. Chen's immigration documents from 40 years ago, Todd's gambling debts, even things about Camilla that no one else should know. The message was clear. He had leverage on everyone. The refinancing scheme was just one tool in his arsenal. He could destroy lives in dozens of ways, all from behind a screen, all perfectly legal, or at least unprovable. The sirens were right outside now. Zach straightened his tie, smoothed his hair, transformed back into the successful businessman. He smiled at the room, cold and confident again. When the police entered, he would be calm, collected, the victim of a misunderstanding. We were the ones who looked disheveled, emotional, potentially unstable, but we had something he didn't expect: unity. As the police entered, every person in that room stood together. Multiple recordings from multiple angles, documents that proved fraud, a pattern of behavior that painted a clear picture, and most importantly, the willingness to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. The two officers who entered assessed the scene quickly. Zach immediately approached them, his demeanor helpful and concerned. He spun a story about being invited to help family friends with financial planning, only to be attacked and accused of wild conspiracies. His delivery was smooth, believable. But then Todd spoke up. His voice shook, but his words were clear. He confessed to his part in the scheme, named Zach as the mastermind, offered to provide evidence. The officers' attention shifted, their posture changing as they recognized this was more complex than a simple dispute. More police arrived, including a detective who specialized in financial crimes. The room became a crime scene, statements being taken, evidence being collected. Zach's confidence began to waver as the scope of what was happening became clear. I watched him try different tactics: charm, intimidation, even attempting to leave. But the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, recorded confessions, fraudulent documents with his fingerprints all over them. His carefully constructed scheme was collapsing. As they led Zach away in handcuffs, he looked back at Camilla one last time. The look in his eyes was chilling. Not defeat, but a promise. This wasn't over. He had resources, connections, lawyers who could turn fraud charges into misunderstandings. The fight was just beginning. The house felt different after he left. Smaller somehow, but also cleaner, like a poison had been extracted. We sat around the dining table, the same table where I'd been humiliated hours earlier, and began to piece together what came next. Lawrence and Shannon were different people now. The pride and prejudice that had defined them earlier had been stripped away, replaced by something rawer, but more honest. They looked at me not as the poor boyfriend who wasn't good enough for their daughter, but as the man who'd helped save their family. But I knew this victory was temporary. Zach would make bail. His lawyers would find loopholes. The other families he'd targeted would need to be warned, protected, united in their defense. The real work was just beginning. As we talked through the night, planning our next moves, I felt Camilla's hand in mine. She'd been strong throughout the ordeal, but I could feel her trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. The man she'd once loved had revealed himself as a monster, and that kind of betrayal leaves scars. The sun was rising by the time we finished giving our statements and making our plans. Todd had agreed to turn state's evidence in exchange for leniency. Emma had contacted the other women from Zach's past, building a network of support and shared testimony. Mrs. Chen and her nephew had uncovered more fraudulent refinancing attempts in the neighborhood, and Lawrence and Shannon, they sat close together, their hands intertwined, facing their financial ruin with something they'd lost along the way: unity. They would lose the mansion, probably most of their assets, but they'd kept something more valuable: their integrity and their family. As I finally prepared to leave, Lawrence stopped me at the door. His handshake was different this time, firm but respectful, the greeting of equals. He thanked me, not just for exposing Zach, but for showing him what really mattered. The executive who'd measured worth in dollars and prestige had learned a harder currency: the value of truth and the cost of pride. I walked to my hit-up Civic as the morning sun painted the sky. The car looked exactly the same as when I'd arrived: dented, peeling, undeniably ugly. But now Lawrence and Shannon watched from their doorway with different eyes. They saw not a symbol of failure, but a reminder that worth isn't measured in possessions. The engine turned over on the first try, reliable as always. As I drove away, I thought about the battle ahead. Zach would regroup, lawyer up, strike back with everything he had. The other families would need protection, guidance, unity. The evidence would need to be preserved, testimonies coordinated, strategies developed. But for now, in this moment, we'd won a victory. Not through wealth or connections or intimidation, but through simple courage and the willingness to stand together. It wasn't the ending, not by a long shot, but it was a beginning. The real fight was about to begin. I froze as Zach waved the letter opener, his movements erratic and unpredictable. Todd had already backed halfway to the door, his face drained of color. The rest of us remained motionless, watching Zach's descent into full narcissistic rage. His rant escalated, voice rising as he detailed everything Camilla supposedly owed him. 2 years of dinners, vacations, gifts. He'd calculated it all, assigned monetary value to every moment. The delusion ran deeper than any of us had realized. In his mind, their relationship had been a business transaction, and he was collecting on a defaulted loan. Then he revealed his final card. His phone screen displayed thumbnails of private photos, Camilla during their relationship, intimate moments she'd trusted him with. The threat hung heavy in the air: compliance or exposure, control through humiliation. Emma stepped forward before anyone could stop her, her own phone raised and recording. She explained calmly that her therapist had taught her to document everything when dealing with narcissistic abuse. Every text, every encounter, every threat. She had months of evidence. Her voice remained steady, even as Zach's face contorted with rage. I weighed my options carefully. Physical intervention could escalate the situation, but standing back might embolden him further. I chose patience, keeping my stance relaxed but ready. Sometimes restraint unnerves an aggressor more than confrontation. My strategy worked. Zach's rage intensified at my calm demeanor. He ranted about disrespect, about people not knowing their place, about the natural order being disrupted. Each word dug his hole deeper, every threat adding to the recording evidence. The breaking point came when Zach moved toward Camilla. Lawrence's paternal instincts finally overrode his executive paralysis. He stepped between them, his body language protective rather than aggressive. The simple act of a father shielding his daughter triggered something primal in Zach. He swung the letter opener wildly, more flailing than attacking. His Harvard MBA hadn't included combat training. I moved then, using basic self-defense techniques learned years ago. A simple wrist control, pressure on the right points, and the letter opener clattered across the marble floor. Zach crumbled without his weapon, his confident facade shattering completely. He dropped to his knees, alternating between threats and pleas. The transformation from predator to pathetic happened in seconds. That's when I noticed Shannon had disappeared from the room. Smart woman. She'd slipped away during the confrontation to trigger their security system's silent alarm. The police would arrive faster than calling 911. While we waited, Zach's attempts to regain control grew increasingly desperate. He tried standing, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He reached for his phone to send those threatening emails, but his hands shook too badly to unlock it. The man who'd orchestrated months of financial terrorism couldn't manage basic motor functions. Todd had pressed himself against the wall, clearly torn between fleeing and staying. Self-preservation warred with the knowledge that running would make everything worse. Todd's carrying a second phone that's been recording this whole time. Something about that feels too neat, like he knew exactly what would happen tonight, which makes me really curious about his actual role in all of this mess. He chose to stay, perhaps the first smart decision he'd made all night. Mrs. Chen's nephew maintained his position by the door, preventing any escape attempts. His banking uniform lent an air of authority to the scene. He'd already begun organizing the scattered documents, separating evidence from general paperwork with practiced efficiency. The police arrived in force, not just patrol officers, but detectives who specialized in financial crimes. Shannon had been specific when triggering the alarm, mentioning fraud and threats. The response reflected the seriousness of her report. Zach immediately tried to spin the narrative. He transformed again, becoming the calm businessman wrongly accused. He claimed we'd lured him here, that this was all a misunderstanding about legitimate business dealings. His story might have worked if we'd been unprepared, but we had multiple recordings from different angles. Emma's documentation stretched back months. Todd's confession came out in a rush, naming names and providing details. Mrs. Chen's nephew presented the forged documents alongside legitimate ones, highlighting the fraudulent elements. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. As officers took statements, more truth emerged. Zach hadn't worked alone. He'd built a network of desperate people like Todd across multiple cities. The scope was staggering. 6 families in our area alone, with evidence suggesting dozens more across the state. The detective's expression grew grimmer with each revelation. This wasn't simple fraud anymore. This was organized crime, albeit white-collar and sophisticated. Zach had crossed lines that his father's money couldn't uncross. They cuffed him with deliberate care, following procedure exactly. No rough handling that his lawyers could later exploit. Zach's final look at Camilla held no remorse, only cold calculation. Even facing arrest, he was planning his next move. After the police left with Zach and Todd, we sat in stunned silence. The adrenaline crash hit everyone differently. Lawrence stared at his hands like he'd never seen them before. Shannon clutched her wine glass without drinking. Emma and Camilla hugged, both shaking with delayed reaction. I started making calls. My assistant needed to know about the security breaches. My clients deserved warnings about the suspicious inquiries. The network Zach had targeted needed protection before his accomplices could strike. Mrs. Chen and her nephew became unexpected allies. They'd already begun contacting neighbors, warning about the fraudulent refinancing schemes. Her nephew used his banking connections to flag suspicious applications, community defense through rapid communication. Lawrence finally found his voice, asking practical questions about next steps, how to protect their remaining assets, whether bankruptcy was still necessary, what legal resources they'd need. The executive was returning, tempered by humility. I outlined a basic strategy: asset protection through proper legal channels, coordination with other victims for collective defense, documentation of all damages for civil suits. The criminal charges were just the beginning. The civil consequences would follow. Shannon surprised everyone by taking charge of victim outreach. She had the social connections and newfound purpose. Within an hour, she'd contacted every family Todd had named, warning them and offering support. Redemption through action rather than words. Emma's role proved crucial. Her months of documentation provided a timeline of Zach's escalation. The pattern was clear. Each rejection intensified his tactics. What started as desperate texts evolved into elaborate financial warfare. The progression showed premeditation, not crimes of passion. Camilla remained quiet through most of this, processing the betrayal. She'd loved someone who saw her as property. That kind of revelation doesn't heal quickly, but she participated when needed, adding details that connected dots others missed. Dawn broke as we finalized immediate protective measures. Everyone had tasks. Lawrence would coordinate with legitimate financial advisors. Shannon would expand the victim network. Emma would share her documentation with prosecutors. Mrs. Chen and her nephew would monitor the neighborhood's financial security. The house felt different in morning light. The pretension had been stripped away, leaving something more honest. The mansion would probably be lost, but the family might be saved. Sometimes destruction clears the path for rebuilding. I prepared to leave, exhausted but oddly satisfied. We'd prevented immediate disaster and exposed a predator. The work ahead would be challenging, but the foundation was solid. Unity born from crisis tends to endure. Lawrence walked me to my Civic. His handshake conveyed respect rather than judgment. He thanked me not just for the help, but for the lesson in values. The man who'd measured worth in possessions was learning different metrics. Shannon joined us, carrying a thermos of coffee for my drive. A small gesture, but genuine. She apologized for dinner, for the judgments, for the blindness. I accepted simply, without dwelling. Forward motion mattered more than past mistakes. Camilla appeared as I opened my car door. She'd changed from the evening dress into jeans and a sweater, looking younger and more vulnerable. She hugged me, whispering thanks that went beyond words. The strong woman who'd confronted her stalker was allowing herself to feel the fear she'd suppressed. As I drove away, I thought about consequences. Zach would make bail within days. His lawyers would file motions and seek delays. The other families would face pressure to settle quietly. The fight was far from over, but something had shifted. A community had awakened to a threat. Victims had found their voices. Evidence had been preserved and shared. Most importantly, people had chosen truth over comfortable lies. 3 months later, the transformation was remarkable. The mansion was gone, sold to cover debts, but Lawrence and Shannon had adapted. They rented a modest apartment near their daughter, finding contentment in simplicity. Lawrence consulted for small businesses, using his experience to help others avoid predators. Shannon volunteered with financial literacy programs, teaching what she'd learned the hard way. Emma had found strength in survival. She still carried student loans, but also self-respect. She'd testified before the grand jury with calm precision, her documentation proving instrumental. Her therapy had evolved from healing trauma to preventing others' victimization. Todd cooperated fully with authorities, providing details about Zach's network. His gambling debts remained, but he'd entered treatment. Some choices can't be undone, but futures can still be salvaged. His testimony would reduce his sentence and maybe, eventually, his guilt. Mrs. Chen and her nephew had become unofficial neighborhood guardians. They'd established a financial watch program, teaching residents to recognize predatory schemes. Simple vigilance preventing complex disasters. The legal proceedings moved slowly but steadily. Zach's lawyers fought every charge, but evidence overwhelmed tactics. 6 families had united in testimony. Dozens more had come forward. His father's influence couldn't suppress that much truth. Zach himself remained unrepentant. Even facing prison, he maintained his delusions. Camilla owed him. The families deserved targeting. He was the victim. Narcissism that deep doesn't reform. It only adapts or gets contained. The Civic still ran perfectly, despite its appearance. I'd kept it partly from sentiment, partly as reminder. Worth isn't in appearances. Value isn't in possessions. True wealth lies in relationships and integrity. Camilla had grown through the ordeal. She'd returned to therapy, processing the trauma properly. She'd also started a support group for others who'd experienced similar stalking, healing through helping others heal. Our relationship had evolved too. Shared crisis creates unique bonds. We'd moved slowly, building on friendship and respect rather than romance and attraction. The foundation was solid because it was honest. The final hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. Zach pleaded guilty to multiple charges, his lawyers having negotiated the best deal possible. 2 years minimum, 5 maximum. Not enough for the damage done, but something. The courtroom was packed with his victims. Each face told a story of financial manipulation and emotional terrorism, but they sat together, united in survival. Zach had created his own worst nightmare, a community bonded by shared resistance to his predation. When the judge read the sentence, 4 years with possibility of parole in 2, the room remained silent. No celebration, no protests, just quiet acknowledgement that justice, while imperfect, had been served. Zach would pay for his crimes, even if the price seemed insufficient. Outside the courthouse, the families gathered briefly, not for celebration, but for closure. They'd continue supporting each other through civil suits and recovery. The bonds forged in crisis would endure beyond legal proceedings. Lawrence shook hands with each person, thanking them for their courage. The executive who'd once judged worth by net worth now valued character over credentials. Shannon hugged victims she'd never met before this ordeal, offering support that transcended social hierarchies. As people dispersed to resume their lives, I reflected on the journey. What started as a dinner disaster had exposed a predator and united a community. Sometimes the worst experiences catalyze the most important changes. The Civic started on the first try, as always. Reliable, unimpressive, perfect for my needs. I drove home thinking about the future. There would be more Zachs in the world, predators who weaponized financial systems against personal grudges, but there would also be more communities willing to stand together, more voices refusing silence, more courage choosing truth over comfort. The battle against Zach was ending, but the war against predation continued. Each victory made the next one more possible. Each survivor made the next victim less alone. Each truth told made the next lie harder to sell. That's the real victory. Not the sentence or the settlements, but the transformation. A community that learned to protect itself. Families that discovered what truly mattered. Individuals who found strength they didn't know they possessed. The story that began with humiliation and prejudice had become something larger. Not a fairy tale ending, but a human one. Messy, imperfect, ongoing, but ultimately hopeful. Because in the end, patient truth had defeated sophisticated lies. And that's a victory worth more than any mansion. What a wild ride this story was. Thanks for reading this story with me. I hope you have a wonderful day. I will see you in the next one.